In the mid-19th century, cities across North America and Europe built schools. Not modest schoolhouses, but monumental, cathedral-scale institutions with load-bearing stone walls, vaulted ceilings, and architectural symmetry that rivaled the civic buildings of ancient Rome. The official explanation is straightforward. Industrial-era governments invested heavily in public education as populations urbanized and literacy became economically essential. That explanation is taught in every history department on the planet. But here is where the numbers become interesting. Between 1840 and 1880, over 4,000 large-scale educational institutions were constructed across the United States alone. Many of these buildings featured heating systems, ventilation shafts, and load-bearing infrastructure engineered for populations 2 to 3 times larger than the cities that supposedly built them. In Manchester, England, a single district completed 7 stone facade school buildings in under a decade, each capable of housing 600 students in a borough whose entire school-age population at the time numbered fewer than 2,000. Buildings were ready before the children arrived. This documentary explores a pattern, a structural and temporal anomaly visible across public records, architectural surveys, and municipal archives from the mid-1800s onward. Nothing presented here is fabricated. Every building referenced exists or existed. Every date comes from public record. What this film examines is not what happened, but the precise order in which things happened and what that sequence may or may not suggest about the civilization that built them. Begin with a single city. Cincinnati, Ohio, 1853. The city's population was approximately 115,000 people. School Board, newly formalized under Ohio's Common School Act, commissioned the construction of what would become known as the Fourth Ward School, a 3-story brick and stone structure with 12 classrooms, a central atrium, ornamental ironwork on the stairwells, and a basement-level mechanical room housing a cast-iron furnace system connected to wall-embedded radiator channels throughout every floor. The furnace system alone required months of pre-planning. The ironwork was sourced from a foundry in Pittsburgh. The stone facade was quarried from 60 miles east. When the building opened in 1855, Cincinnati's enrolled student population for that ward was 340 children. The school had capacity for 900. For the first 11 years of its operation, more than half of its classrooms sat unused. This would be unremarkable if it were isolated. Planners overshoot. Cities grow. Governments build for the future. These are rational explanations, and they deserve to be taken seriously. But Cincinnati was not isolated. In Buffalo, New York, the first cohort of large municipal schools, built between 1848 and 1862, opened with average occupancy rates of 38%. In Louisville, Kentucky, a school completed in 1857 featured a second-floor assembly hall with fixed wooden seating for 400, installed during original construction, in a district with fewer than 200 enrolled students at the time of opening. In St. Louis, Missouri, school construction between 1850 and 1870 outpaced enrollment growth by a factor of nearly 3 to 1. Pattern holds across the Midwest. It holds in the South. It holds in New England. What makes an anomaly worth examining is not its existence in one place. It is its recurrence across geography, across administrations, across entirely separate political and economic contexts. In Halifax, Nova Scotia, the Provincial Education Commission oversaw the construction of 14 stone schoolhouses between 1851 and 1869. The commission's own ledgers, preserved in the Nova Scotia archives, show projected enrollment figures that were consistently lower than building capacity at time of completion. Not slightly lower, structurally lower, as if the capacity calculations were drawn from a different source than the population census. In Glasgow, Scotland, school board records from the 1870s show similar patterns. Buildings designed for 700 students opened to enroll 280. Glasgow School Board's own minutes from a session in November 1873 contain a line that has attracted occasional historical attention. A board member noting that the new Garnet Hill building had been designed in accordance with prior specifications, without elaborating what those prior specifications were, or where they originated. Prior specifications. The architectural language itself is worth noting, not because architecture is evidence of anything conspiratorial, but because consistency in style across vast geographic distances before the age of mass communication is a factual curiosity. The schools built across Ohio, Pennsylvania, Upper Canada, and the Scottish lowlands between 1845 and 1875 share recognizable features. Symmetrical facades. Central entrance towers or porticos. Tall, narrow windows arranged in rhythmic repetition. Interior corridor layouts that follow nearly identical proportions. Basement-level utility, infrastructure, furnaces, coal storage, ventilation risers, built into original foundations rather than added later. These features appear in buildings commissioned by entirely separate municipal bodies, in countries with separate governments, financed through separate tax structures, designed by architects who, in many cases, had no documented professional connection to one another. The similarity is not absolute, but it is consistent enough to notice. Architectural historians have offered several explanations for this convergence. The spread of pattern books, published guides to institutional design, circulated among architects and city planners, is the most commonly cited. By the 1840s, books like Edward Ashworth's designs for schools and schoolhouses were available in both Britain and North America, and their influence on municipal construction is well documented. That explanation accounts for the stylistic similarity. It is less clear that it accounts for the scale. A pattern book recommends proportions. It does not explain why city after city in separate countries with separate budgets operating under separate legal frameworks for public education consistently built institutions substantially larger than their documented populations required and did so in roughly the same 30-year window. The window itself is the detail that keeps surfacing. 1840 to 1875. Across the northeastern United States, across Canada's eastern provinces, across industrial Britain. Fortress-scaled schools, stone and brick, over-engineered, ahead of demand. There is a name that has become attached to this pattern in recent years, not a historical term, not an academic designation, but a label that emerged from online communities examining old photographs, municipal records, and architectural surveys. That label carries its own complications, its own mythology, its own distortions. But the pattern that prompted the label existed before the label did. And the pattern begins, if you trace it far enough back, not in 1840, but in a single catastrophic year that rewrote climate, agriculture, and human survival across the entire Northern Hemisphere. The year 1816 does not appear in most conversations about 19th century infrastructure. It appears in meteorology papers, in agricultural histories, in accounts of famine and displacement. It is known, where it is known at all, as the year without a summer, a period following the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora in present-day Indonesia, when volcanic ash suspended in the upper atmosphere reduced global temperatures enough to destroy harvests across the Northern Hemisphere for an entire growing season. In New England, snow fell in June. In France, grain prices tripled. In Ireland, a famine preceded the more famous one by 3 decades. In Bengal, a disrupted monsoon contributed to a cholera outbreak that would eventually circle the globe. Tens of thousands died, hundreds of thousands displaced. An entire generation of rural families in northeastern America and northern Europe lost their economic footing in a single year. That is the accepted history, and it is accurate. What is less frequently examined is what happened in the decade immediately following and what was built. The Erie Canal broke ground in 1817. 1 year after the worst agricultural catastrophe in living memory, the state of New York began constructing what would become the most consequential piece of inland infrastructure in American history. 363-mile artificial waterway connecting the Hudson River to Lake Erie, hand-dug, stone-lined, engineered with a precision that contemporary observers found difficult to fully explain given the available technology and the speed of execution. The canal was completed in 1825. 8 years. In the 19th century, through forests, wetlands, and solid rock. It immediately performed beyond any reasonable projection. Within a year of opening, it was carrying more tonnage than its designers had calculated it would handle in a decade. Warehousing along the canal corridor, grain elevators, dry goods storage, livestock facilities had been built in advance of that traffic, not in response to it. The infrastructure preceded the demand that justified it. This is not a controversial observation. Canal historians have noted it. The standard explanation is visionary planning that the canal's architects simply anticipated growth correctly and built accordingly. That explanation becomes more complicated when you extend it across the continent. Between 1820 and 1860, the United States laid approximately 30,000 miles of railroad track. Pace was extraordinary by any measure, but what receives less attention than the track itself is the supporting infrastructure, the depots, the roundhouses, the water towers, the coal storage facilities, the signal stations built alongside it. In dozens of documented cases, rail infrastructure was completed and operational before sufficient traffic existed to justify its maintenance costs. Stations built for cities that would not reach their projected populations for another 20 years. Roundhouses sized for locomotive fleets that would not exist for another decade. In Sandusky, Ohio, a rail depot completed in 1850 contained ticketing infrastructure, waiting areas, and administrative offices scaled for a transit volume the city would not actually reach until 1871. The same pattern appears in England's rail expansion of the 1840s, the period known as railway mania. Thousands of miles of track laid in under a decade. Terminal stations in Manchester, Leeds and Birmingham, built with a grandeur and a passenger capacity that seemed, at the time, almost delusional given actual ridership numbers. Within 20 years, those numbers had caught up, but the buildings were ready first. Infrastructure before demand. Again and again. Return now to the schools, because the schools are not separate from this pattern. They are the most numerous, the most geographically consistent, and in some ways the most structurally curious expression of it. Rail depot built too large can be explained by investor optimism. A canal built too wide can be explained by commercial ambition. These are profit-driven enterprises, and overbuilding in anticipation of profit has a clear psychological logic. Public schools are not profit-driven. They are administered by municipal governments. They are funded by local taxation. They are built, in theory, in direct proportion to demonstrated need. There is no investor expecting a return. There is no commercial incentive to build for populations that do not yet exist. And yet they were built that way regardless. In Pennsylvania between 1850 and 1865, the state's newly established Board of Common Schools oversaw construction of 312 permanent school buildings. An analysis of enrollment records from the period available through the Pennsylvania State Archives shows that 71% of those buildings opened with occupancy below 50% of designed capacity. The average time before a building reached 75% occupancy was 14 years. 14 years of underused space, 14 years of heating systems running at partial load, 14 years of maintenance costs on classrooms that sat empty. This was not an accident of one administration or one state. Ohio showed near identical ratios, Indiana slightly lower. New York, accounting for faster urban growth, still showed consistent patterns of early-stage under-occupancy in its municipal school construction. The administrative similarity is harder to dismiss than the architectural similarity. Buildings can converge in style through shared pattern books, but administrative behavior, budget allocations, capacity planning, procurement timelines is shaped by local governments operating under local pressures. For that behavior to converge across states with different laws, different tax bases, different political cultures, and different rates of urbanization requires either an extraordinary coincidence or a shared source of instruction. In the United Kingdom, the Education Act of 1870 formalized a national school board system and triggered a construction wave that mirrored what had already occurred in the United States over the previous 2 decades. English school boards, operating under new government authority, built at a pace and scale that consistently exceeded documented enrollment. The London School Board alone constructed 400 buildings between 1871 and 1895. Average opening occupancy across those buildings was documented internally at 54%. The board's own inspectors noted the surplus capacity in annual reports. It was not treated as a problem. It was treated as appropriate provision. Appropriate provision for whom exactly was not specified. There is a quality to this accumulation of evidence that resists easy categorization. Each individual instance, an oversized depot, an underused school, canal built ahead of its traffic can be explained individually. Visionary planning, political ambition, bureaucratic miscalculation. These explanations are available, and they are not implausible. But the accumulation changes the texture of the question. When the same pattern appears across public education, transportation, water infrastructure, and grain storage across the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom, within the same compressed historical window built by separate governments, financed through separate mechanisms, designed by architects with no documented coordination, the individual explanations begin to strain against the aggregate weight of the data. Something was being built, broadly, quickly, and consistently overscaled for the populations that were supposed to be using it. Whether that reflects the inheritance of something older or the convergence of something newly shared is precisely the question that a particular label, one that has become both illuminating and deeply problematic, was invented to answer. Phase 3, Start Caro 0206. The word Tartaria does not appear in 19th century municipal records. It does not appear in the architectural surveys of the Erie Canal, in Pennsylvania's school board minutes, or in the London School Board's annual reports on occupancy rates. It is not a term that the builders of those fortress-scale schools would have recognized or used to describe themselves or their civilization. It is a modern label, and understanding what it actually means, historically, cartographically, and in its contemporary reinterpretation, is essential to understanding why it became attached to the pattern this documentary has been tracing. On maps produced in Europe between the 16th and 18th centuries, vast territory stretching from Eastern Europe through Central Asia to the Pacific coast of Siberia was labeled, in Latin, as Tartaria or Grand Tartary. This was not a unified empire in the modern sense. It was a cartographic convention, a catch-all designation used by European mapmakers to describe territories that fell outside their direct political knowledge. People living across those regions were diverse. Turkic, Mongolic, Slavic, dozens of other ethnic and linguistic groups. What they shared from the European cartographer's perspective was geographic remoteness and political opacity. By the 19th century, as European powers extended their geographic knowledge eastward, the term faded from maps. Russia had absorbed much of the territory. Central Asian Khanates had been documented individually. Tartaria, as a cartographic designation, became obsolete, and it disappeared from formal usage entirely by the mid-1800s. That is the historical record. Straightforward, well-documented, and largely uncontested among academic cartographers and historians. The modern reinterpretation of Tartaria began not in academic circles but in online communities, emerging with particular momentum around 2017 and 2018 on platforms where historical photographs, architectural surveys, and municipal records were being circulated and examined by non-academic audiences. The reinterpretation proposed something fundamentally different from the cartographic definition. It suggested that Tartaria or Tartary referred not merely to a geographic region on old maps, but to a lost global civilization, technologically sophisticated, architecturally prolific, and deliberately erased from the historical record sometime in the 19th century. The oversized schools, the Erie Canal, the over-engineered rail infrastructure, the fortress-like civic buildings, all of it, in this reinterpretation, was not built by the Victorian-era governments that official history credits. It was inherited, repursed, quietly absorbed into the expanding narrative of industrial-era progress by powers that needed to obscure where it actually came from. This is the framework that has spread most widely, and it is worth examining with the same care applied to everything else in this film. Three distinct interpretive models have emerged from the accumulation of evidence this documentary has traced. They are not equally supported by the historical record, but they are each, in their own way, a serious attempt to account for what the numbers show. The first model is the conventional planning model. It holds that what looks like overbuilding was simply forward-thinking governance, that the administrators and architects of the mid-19th century were unusually competent at projecting population growth, and that the apparent gap between capacity and enrollment reflects deliberate long-range planning rather than any deeper anomaly. This model is the default position of academic history, and it has genuine explanatory power. Cities did grow. The buildings did fill up. The canal did reach its projected traffic volumes. Planning for growth is rational. Where this model strains is at the administrative uniformity across disconnected jurisdictions. It does not fully account for why municipal governments in Ohio, Ontario, and Glasgow, operating under different laws, different budgets, and different demographic pressures, converged on the same overscaled construction ratios within the same 30-year window without any documented coordination mechanism. The second model is the inheritance model. It proposes that some of the structures attributed to Victorian-era construction were not built from scratch by the governments that claimed them, but were instead existing structures older, possibly much older, that were repurposed, renamed, and absorbed into the administrative records of expanding nation-states. Under this model, prior specifications, referenced in the Glasgow School Board minutes of 1873, were not a design template from a published pattern book. They were dimensions taken from a building that already existed. This model is difficult to verify and difficult to dismiss. Architectural dating is an imprecise science. Foundation layers are rarely excavated without cause. Documentary record of a building's construction is only as reliable as the institutions that created it, and the institutions that created it had, in many cases, strong administrative incentives to present newly acquired assets as newly built ones. The third model is the parallel development model. It holds that the convergence of architectural style, administrative behavior, and infrastructure scale across the United States, Canada, and Britain in mid-19th century reflects not a shared inheritance, but a shared moment that the disruption of 1816, the year without a summer, triggered a synchronized reconstruction impulse across the Northern Hemisphere, and that what looks like coordination was actually the simultaneous response of multiple societies to the same catastrophic stimulus. Under this model, the buildings were built when the records say they were built, but they were built by civilizations that were collectively rebuilding rapidly at scale, with a shared urgency that explains both the pace and the consistent oversizing. You build larger than you need when you are not sure how much you will need. You build for a future population because the present population is still recovering. Turn now to 1816. A volcano erupts in Indonesia. Ash spreads across the upper atmosphere. The summer fails across the northern hemisphere. Harvests collapse. Populations destabilize. Tens of thousands die. And then, within a year, within a decade, something begins to be built. Canals, railways, schools, grain storage, water systems, civic institutions of unusual scale and unusual permanence. Built quickly, built consistently, built, in many cases, larger than the populations that were supposed to use them required. The metaphor that feels most accurate, not most dramatic, not most satisfying, but most accurate, is not of a lost civilization suddenly rediscovered. It is of a civilization in the act of reconstruction, moving so fast and so broadly that the resulting infrastructure consistently outpaced the human recovery it was designed to support. Buildings were ready before the people arrived. Not because the people had been erased, but possibly because the people were still, in 1840, in 1850, in 1860, finding their way back. The evidence gathered across this documentary does not resolve into a single clean answer. The conventional planning model accounts for some of it. The inheritance model accounts for details that the first model cannot easily absorb. The parallel development model offers a human scale to the pattern that the other two sometimes lose. What the evidence does is invite a particular kind of attention, not to conspiracy, not to revelation, but to the precise sequence of events. What was built, when it was built, for how many people it was built, and whether the civilization that built it was expanding into the future or recovering from a past that history has not yet fully learned to describe. The schools are still standing in many of these cities. Some have been converted, some demolished, some still in use, their corridors slightly too wide, their ceilings slightly too high, their foundations slightly too deep for what they were supposed to be. The evidence invites examination. What you conclude from it depends entirely on which questions you are willing to sit with long enough to let them breathe.